For this presentation, Nicholas and I decided to focus on what we thought was a particularly interesting aspect of early Christian history in Alexandria, the city's frequent ethno-religious conflict and violence, from state-run persecution to mob-led vigilantism. To begin our discussion about Alexandria, it's important that we first understand the cultural environment of the city. Alexandria in antiquity was a multicultural hub. As the capital of Hellenic and later Roman Egypt, it was not only a center for Greek learning and thought, but was also the site of extensive cross-cultural mixing between Greek and Egyptian paganism. At right, we have an image taken from an Alexandrian tomb showing the mummification of Osiris by Anubis, which is directly above a scene depicting the abduction of Persephone by Hades. We can see from this that the pagan inhabitants of Alexandria were perfectly comfortable incorporating elements of both Egyptian and Greek polytheism into their lives. Besides pagan culture, however, Alexandria was also an important center for the Jewish diaspora. Josephus tells us in his Antiquities that many Jews left Palestine for Egypt due to its fertile soil and the relative political freedom afforded by the Ptolemaic dynasty. Jews in Alexandria, like in other parts of the Mediterranean, interacted and often partook in Hellenic culture and philosophy, which is most easily exemplified by the Hellenic Jewish philosopher Philo of Alexandria. Alexandria is also believed to be the site of the first Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, the Septuagint. While it is true that Alexandria was a dynamic multicultural city which served as an important site for cross-cultural exchange in the Mediterranean, relations between the different ethnic and religious groups in Alexandria often were not peaceful. I will preface this by saying that I am going to be making some very broad generalizations about a complicated subject. I think it's important, though, that we have a basic understanding of ancient concepts of race, culture, and religion, which were often quite different from ours. In general, ancient people had a less static view of ethnic, religious, and cultural identity than we do. For example, people with very different ancestral backgrounds could be considered Roman without ever having visited the city of Rome. When it came to labeling of cultural identity, Romans were more concerned with the way people lived instead of the physical, biological, and ancestral factors we tend to focus on for our modern conceptions of race, culture, and religion. People could become Roman by integrating and assimilating themselves into the Roman civic, public, and religious life. This is one of the reasons Romans often viewed Jews with suspicion, because many Jews, for religious reasons, refused to take part in the Roman way of life. Alexandria, however, was a little different from the rest of the ancient world. Haas tells us that Alexandrians had a slightly more hard outlook on race. Alexandrians were often more divided in their ethno-religious identities. It's impossible to determine exactly why this was, but Haas speculates that this may be due to the long history of a large Jewish presence in the city, which would ultimately result in the Jewish revolts of 115 to 117 in Egypt and Libya, also known as the Kitos War. The Kitos War may have caused more angst between Alexandrians and their Jewish neighbors, which may have led to the deepening ethno-religious divisions which continued to plague the city throughout the early Christian era. The divisive climate present in Alexandria periodically translated itself into violent clashes, riots, and vigilantism by religiously motivated mobs. A number of ancient sources tell us about Alexandria being particularly prone to violent unrest when compared to other cities in the Roman world. Evagrius, an ancient historian, says that the Alexandrians, quote, allow very trivial pretexts to foment the flame of commotion. Socrates of Constantinople tells us that, quote, more than any other people, the Alexandrians delight in uproar, and that, quote, their ardor does not end without bloodshed. There are several other instances in which ancient writers have characterized the Alexandrians in such a way. It would be an oversimplification to explain Alexandrians' propensity towards violence solely in terms of their hot-headedness, as many of the ancient authors tend to do. Rather, we should be cognizant of the complicated political and religious past which made Alexandria the way it was, a city often racked by instability caused by ethno-religious violence. Now, this is also not to say that Alexandria was doomed to suffer unending cycles of racial violence, as there are some periods of time when the city enjoyed relative peace and stability. As always, the situation is more complicated than it at first seems, but, based on the characterizations of the ancient writers, as well as the plethora of instances which back up their claims, it is safe to say that Alexandria was unusual in the frequency at which it suffered from ethno-religious violence. Truly, there are many, many instances of mob violence featuring Jews, Christians, as well as pagans. If our presentation seems to present Christians as the only instigators of this violence, it truly is only because we are focusing on the instances of violence most relevant to Christianity, not because of a lack of material to work with.
We will now discuss the interactions between the Christian Church in Alexandria and their pagan religions. While Christianity and paganism were not the only two religious beliefs present in Alexandria, the ones with our focus were the events that the Christian Church took against the pagan cults after legalization in 1312-1313 CE. While one thinks persecution was towards the Christians, in the case of Alexandria and other parts of the Roman Empire after legalization, Christians took actions against the pagans for reasons which we will now dive into. To understand the view that Alexandria's religious leaders and scholars had in regards to the pagans, we dive into Athanasius of Alexandria's writings. In the eyes of the bishop of Alexandria, pagan religions were distractions and idols, created to take the focus away from the one and only God. This idea is confirmed by Firmicus in Persecution, calling the pagans a superstitious cult whose faith in their rituals was a threat to their moral faith. Athanasius references Genesis and the golden calf created by the Israelites, claiming that they are in the same realm of sin and corruption. What stands out in this evaluation of the pagan culture, however, is a specific quote by Athanasius. For had they known them to be gods, they would not have lamented them as if they had perished. For this was why they represented them in an image, namely, because they not only did not think of them as gods, but did not believe them to exist at all, and in order that the sight of their form in the image might console them for being no more. From our understanding, this suggests that the disrespect went beyond ignorance, to the belief that the pagans claimed these gods as beings with an ability to fail and make mistakes. To the Christian view, God is an all-knowing and all-powerful deity. We can understand that the confusion comes from the lack of reliance and trust that the pagans placed in their gods, which explains the disrespect for the pagan religion, not as one as they don't follow, but as one that is a morally and theologically damaged religion. Considering this Christian view of the pagans, toleration was an idea well past its opportunity to be a viable option. However, attempts to accumulate the pagans in positions of power in the 300s prove that it was the intention of religious officials for a peaceful incorporation of the Christian values in pagans. Yet, in instances around the empire, conspiracies took place in the leadership involving the practices of pagan rituals, specifically in Antioch in 371, after which pagan toleration was diminished. By the time that Symmachus made a famous appeal in 384, it was too late for a coexistence between them and the church, because at that time, Christianity controlled the Roman Empire, deeming it the Christian Empire by a variety of sources. We can see from these sources that since Constantine converted to Christianity, anti-pagan laws were placed in order to discourage pagan cults, beliefs, and practices that threatened the Christian beliefs and morals. We will discuss that anti-pagan laws that seem to show small amounts of tolerance of pagan practices, allowing periods for the pagans to accumulate to the new order. These moments of toleration are an effort to make a more peaceful conversion of the pagans into the new religion. However, we will see how that was not the case in a couple of instances. Athanasius' views of the pagan theology implied the need for the destruction of the ideologies that served as a distraction to the Christian goal of moral perfection. These thoughts provoked those leading the Christian empire to take action on the legal scale, all for the good of the church. In Macmillan's Persecution, he puts this idea as, so long as unbelievers clung to their old ways, and indeed far more challenging numbers than the Christian record would acknowledge, good believers must fulfill divine command. Page 12. Now that the empire was under the Christian expectation, it was assumed that it was the duty of the empire to protect the church from the distraction and immorality of the pagan practices and superstition. Since Constantine's conversion in 1312, his successors made laws regarding the practices of the pagan cults, these being the main three. In 435, empires of the East banned animal sacrifices and ordered all pagan religious buildings to be purified and destroyed. In 1472, superstition was guilty of public crime. In 502, gifts of pagan value were forbidden. Often the penalty of these new crimes were forced baptisms and teachings of the Christian faith. Other penalties included the stripping of land, forcing of many pagans and their families into poverty.
One major instance of religious violence in Alexandria is the violent death of the female philosopher Hypatia. Hypatia was an influential pagan voice in Alexandrian politics. Widely recognized as a brilliant mind, she acted not only in the role of a teacher, but, as was common in the Roman pagan intellectual tradition, acted as a political and economic benefactor to her students. The relationship between patrons and their protégés was very important in Roman pagan society, and inspired much loyalty in Hypatia's students who were both pagan and Christian themselves. Sometime during the spring of 415, Hypatia, while riding home in her carriage, was attacked by what was probably a Christian mob. The mob dragged her through the streets to the front of the Caesareum, a former pagan temple which had been converted into a church, and beat her to death with pieces of pottery. They then gouged her eyes out and dragged her remains outside of the city, where they were cremated. Cremation in Alexandria was viewed in stark contrast to the elaborate burial rituals traditionally undertaken by Egyptian pagans. Also, cremation outside of the city was viewed as a way to cleanse the city of the supposed corruption that person brought with them. Furthermore, the fact that Hypatia was murdered in front of the Caesareum, which had been a pagan temple devoted to emperor worship before being converted into a church, shows us that her killing was rife with religious and political motivations. 3 years before Hypatia's death in 412, Cyril succeeded his uncle Theophilus as bishop of Alexandria. At the beginning of Cyril's patriarchate, he took measures attempting to increase his political authority in the city. This brought him into conflict with the civil authorities of Alexandria, who enjoyed the support of Hypatia and her circle of influential friends and students. Although there is no evidence that can definitively link Cyril to Hypatia's death, it seems likely that he may have been involved in, or even have been behind the attack, especially given that Cyril seems to have participated in a public smear campaign that accused Hypatia of sorcery. Socrates of Constantinople tells us that Hypatia's death was due to Cyril's jealousy of her political power. However, other sources contradict this point. While we will probably never know for sure who was responsible for Hypatia's death, it is clear that it served as the death blow to the pagan civic intellectual elite in Alexandria, and helped to further concentrate urban political power into the hands of the bishop.